is April 3, 2023 at the Nashville Bar Association. And this is the oral history interview of Judge Penny Harrington. And I am Mary Burrs, and I have the pleasure and honor today of interviewing Judge Harrington. Hello, Judge Harrington. How are you today?
Very good.
We're so glad that you have agreed to provide your professional life to the Oral History Project. It is so good to have you here today. You have had such an interesting and varied experience in professional life, but let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the fact that you are deeply rooted in Tennessee. Is that right?
I have many generations.
And particularly in West Tennessee, correct?
In West Tennessee, yes.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about your grandparents. We can go way back, but tell us a little bit about them.
Well, my grandparents were Joseph Harrington and Mattie Bell Harrington. He was a traveling engineer for the Illinois Central Railroad. He had been a founding member of the Locomotive Brotherhood. I'm kind of proud of that, of my Union background. And they raised three sons in Jackson, the oldest of which was my father. He went to Spring Hill College and taught by the Jesuits, and then graduated from the law school at the University of Kentucky. His youngest brother, my Uncle Jack, is still living, and at the age of 96 is still driving himself around Memphis. He was with the National Labor Relations Board and was their regional attorney. My father was a lawyer and a city judge in Jackson, Tennessee, and his law partner was David Murray. David Murray's brother was the congressman in the 7th District of Tennessee for about 40 years, I think it was. So I kind of grew up in politics. My mother's family was very political as well. Her grandfather had been mayor of Jackson, and her uncle was the sheriff of Madison County. And she worked for the state. So we were always involved with politics and all of that. And I grew up in it. One of my earliest memories is handing out cards at the polls.
And your brother is a lawyer also.
My brother's 7 years younger than I am. I insisted that he finish law school before I started. Our father died when we were both quite young. And so he's been my only child, except for his children, who are my favorite grandchildren. But he graduated in 1979 from Vanderbilt Law School and went to work for Al Gore Jr. Served as his legal counsel when he was in the Senate, and then served on his staff when he was vice president. Larry then went to the Inter-American Development Bank, which is their development banks for all the continents. He's always been a Spanish speaker, so he's loved that. And that's really where he finished his career, finally as the bank representative in Mexico, where both of his children became fluent in Spanish, as is he. I'm very proud of them. They're my children.
Yes. And the sparks of being a lawyer are also deep in your soul as well, are they not?
They are. I don't know why, but ever since I was a little girl, I wanted to be, quote, a lawyer like my dad. One of my earliest memories is one of my daddy's lawyer friends saying to me, "Oh, you can't be a lawyer. Little girls aren't lawyers." It really made me mad. And I think I was all bored.
The spark was still there.
Oh, it lived on. It lived on. Like any good woman my age, or would be lawyer my age, I got my teaching certificate, and I taught French in high school for 3 years. Then I had a newsletter on Tennessee government and politics, which is still publishing today, I'm happy to say, as the Tennessee Journal. Then I went to work for Ned McWhorter as his press secretary and speechwriter. I stayed with him a year, but I loved him, but he was cheap and wouldn't give me a raise. So I went to work for Lieutenant Governor John Wilder as his legislative assistant and press secretary. And I got a lot of experience with legislation with Governor Wilder. It was funny, after a few weeks after I went to work for him, I had laryngitis when I started. I hear I'm subject to it. And we discovered that we were actually third cousins. And his mother had actually lived with my family while she came to Jackson to go to the Methodist Conference Female Institute. So we really had a good 5 years together. I learned a lot about law, and we changed the laws in Tennessee to scent and distribution, which any lawyers watching this will understand. At the time, Tennessee was one of only 3 states in the country that still recognized common law in that area of probate. So when I helped explain that to a lot of non-lawyers, both in the House and the Senate, I figured maybe I could go to law school. So I did.
Wonderful. I'm going to back up a bit because bringing you to this point, there's a lot of life that we want to make sure that people understand, because it took quite a bit of your hard work to get to this point. And so I want to back up a little bit and talk about where you went to college and what some of your experiences were leading up to this point where you are working with Governor McWhorter and then Governor Wilder, and the amazing things that you did. Where did you go to college, and how did that all?
Well, I started at Memphis State, which is now the University of Memphis, and I was putting myself through with part-time jobs and with my savings from having been a long-distance telephone operator in the summer.
For Elvis Presley as well, is that right?
Well, I actually did get to place a call for him once. Absolutely amazing. So, anyway, I was able to get in a year and a half, and then the Social Security that I was receiving as my father's dependent was cut off, and I just had to drop out of school. I just didn't have any money. So I had seen my great uncle Jennings Perry at a family wedding, and had told him that I was dropping out and needed to look for a job. And he said, well, come to Nashville and I'll find you one. So he was formerly an editor at the Tennessee and had seemed to know everybody in Nashville, including everybody in state government.
That
So
was a perfect match for you, wasn't it?
It was a perfect match, yeah. Mary and I really got along quite well. So I came to Nashville. I lived in the apartment over his garage. He got me a job with the state of Tennessee as a clerk in the Department of Safety, making $155 a month.
Wow.
And I kept trying to learn to type. I never did, so it became pretty clear to me that I needed to figure out some kind of way to get back to college. Fortunately, Congress changed the rules, and I was able to get $77.10 a month as a college student up to the age of 22 as my father's
Yes.
surviving dependent.
Yes.
And so that's what I went to school on, that and a $300 loan.
What did you major in?
Political science, what else? And minored in French.
And you did teach for a few years,
I did.
and you taught French, is that right?
I taught French in high school. I taught at Hillsborough High School for 2 years. And then the year before busing started, they asked for volunteers to make all the faculties 80-20. So I volunteered and went to Cameron, which at that time was all African American. And one of my students, who was a 3rd-year French student, I only had 2 of those, was named Waverly Crenshaw.
Oh, my.
A few years later, Waverly was in my class at Vanderbilt Law School. And today, Waverly Crenshaw, who clerked with my brother, by the way, for Judge Nixon, Waverly Crenshaw, as you know, is the chief district judge for the United States for the Middle District of Tennessee.
Have you tested his French lately?
He took Larry and me through a tour of the new building
Oh.
and made me promise if he did that I wouldn't ask him anything in French. He's a wonderful.
Maybe someday, that will be something that he'll be interested in reviving. Now, interestingly, as you mentioned earlier, you and your husband at the time established the Tennessee Report. Is that right?
That's right.
And what was that? And of course, we all know what it is, but just for the record, tell us about the Tennessee Report and its life that it took on.
Well, it was intended to be copied somewhat after the Kiplinger letter. Said it was 4 pages long, folded out, came weekly, and had information about Tennessee government and politics. For a while, one of our good friends, Will Cheek, who went on to be chairman of the Democratic Party in Tennessee, wrote one of the pages. It's the Cheek Report. He was always kind of the leading edge of, well, edgy, what he was willing to say.
Yes.
But we had a lot of fun with it. It was very difficult to do in those days because we didn't have computers. Everything was done on a typewriter. Then it had to be brought to a printer, be typeset. We had to have a light table sometimes because the only way you could edit was to take an X-Acto knife and cut things out and put them back in. It was a production.
It was. It must have been.
It really was. It'd be quite easy to do today. Of course, you can email it.
Yes.
Which is what the Tennessee Report Journal does.
You had some experience yourself in journalism with the Knoxville Sentinel. Is that right?
I did.
Yeah.
For the first part of 1970, I worked for the Knoxville News Sentinel as an assistant correspondent on Capitol Hill. I was the first woman there, and it was an interesting experience. There were these old guys who had been there 30 years, and they thought, "What's this blonde doing here?"
But that was nothing to defeat you, was it?
No, it wasn't. It just ruined my cursing, I'm afraid.
A new kind of French.
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, well, you had mentioned earlier that you had worked for Governor, well, I guess when he was Speaker, Ned McWhirter, and worked as his press secretary.
Press secretary.
Press secretary. And that was a result of your experience already in the world of newspapers and journalism.
I think it was largely a function that he didn't like the press very much, and he wanted a buffer between him and them, and because I knew everybody in the press corps, and so it was easy for me to deal with who wanted what and to write press releases for him and to arrange for him to have interviews. And I also wrote a few speeches. I didn't write as many speeches for him as I did for Wilder.
You went on to work for Governor Wilder, didn't you?
I did.
I call him Governor Wilder because when we arrived in Tennessee, that was his name, Governor Wilder, as the lieutenant governor.
Oh, that's what he wanted to be called.
Yes.
He said, "You can call me Speaker Wilder. You can call me Governor Wilder, just don't call me Lieutenant."
Okay.
John Shelton is what all his friends call him.
And with Governor Wilder, you also worked on the probate code for the state of Tennessee.
I did.
And at that time, you had not gone to law school yourself.
No, I hadn't. I worked on several statutory things for him, but the biggest one I did was the total revision of the Tennessee laws of descent and distribution. At that time, we were using the common law, and there were a few statutes that actually addressed what happens to your property when you die without a will. That's what descent and distribution is.
Yes.
So there was a model code that was available nationwide.
Right.
States adopted it with various changes. And so we used that as a basis. And one of the lawyers in the legislative services, where I think you once worked, helped us draft it. And then we introduced it, but then had to go around and explain it, explain it to the non-lawyers. Of course, the lawyers all knew what it was and what it did.
You've had a lot of experience and a lot of education, even before you walked through the front door of a law school, hadn't you?
Well, I had. And of course, I was married to Bo Edwards while he was in law school. So I learned a lot about being a law student from him. And of course, my brother was in law school, living with us at the time. And then Bo became an assistant district attorney for 3 or 4 years. And then he became a criminal defense lawyer. So I learned all of those things before I went to law school.
And there have been some years had passed, and there was more of an opportunity for women to go to law school at that
Oh,
point.
absolutely. Did you not see the little story? I think it was in the Bar Journal about the women who passed the bar in 1968.
No, I didn't read it.
Maybe it was in the Tennessee Bar Journal. Anyway, the three women who passed in 1968, well, there was a couple of women in Knoxville whose names I don't know.
Yes.
And the three women from Nashville were Mrs. Martha Craig Daughtry, Mrs. Jane Ann Owen Woods, and Miss Rosary Palermo.
Oh, my. Oh, my. And we all know of these women as stellar figures in the history of Tennessee law.
Well, Rose, of course, became an outstanding, perhaps the outstanding divorce lawyer of her generation.
Rose by any other name.
Well, by any other name is true, because you see, Rose got married, and Rose, like me, did not want to change her name. But Rose wanted to run for I think it was the county executive committee. And so she filed her paperwork, and the lady who had been the registrar of elections for generations said that she could not run under her name of Palermo, that because she was married, she had to use her married name. And so Rose brought a lawsuit, and it was Palermo v. Dunn, very famous among feminists at the time, which
It still is.
and still is. Isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Well, my dear good friend and patron, Joe Henry, is the Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, and he wrote the opinion. And Rose was allowed to run under her name, and the rest of us were allowed to keep our names.
Justice Henry was a remarkable man, and I understand that Justice Henry was encouraging you to go to law school.
Oh, he did. He did. Very much encouraged me to go to law school. In those days, there was no administrative office of the courts. There was a secretary to the Supreme Court who did the administrative functions. And he wanted to hire me to do that job. He said he'd pay me more than Wilder was paying me. That had happened because I had helped him and my husband and Sissy Daughtry and a few other people.
When you say Sissy Daughtry, you're speaking about Martha Craig Daughtry.
Judge Martha.
Judge, right.
She wasn't a judge then.
But we all know her as Sissy.
She was a professor at Vanderbilt Law School at the time. But my husband had the idea that Tennessee needed to have rules of criminal procedure. We had civil procedure, of course. So they formed a committee. They were all on it. Joe Henry was their liaison with the Supreme Court. They met a lot of times, and Joe and I got to know each other really, really well, as well as the fact that he and Wilder were good friends. So he wanted to hire me after that experience to work for the court, but discovered that there was a requirement that the person for that position be a lawyer. So he said, well, you just got to go to law school. I said, well, Judge, I just can't just go to law school just because you want to hire me for this job. And he said, well, I want to hire you for it, and I can't do it unless you're a lawyer, so you got to go to law school. Well, okay.
Well, don't you think he also knew that you would be a wonderful lawyer?
I think so. I think if he had left, he would have hired me too.
More to this than just the job.
He was quite a character. So,
Who are some of the other people who are influencing you to go to law school at this time?
well, of course, Mary Schaffner. Mary Schaffner and I were best friends. She was about 6 years older than I, and she had started law school, I think, in '74, and had just graduated. And she was clerking for Judge Gilbert Merritt, and she a clerk for Justice Brock on the Supreme Court as well. But she was very, very encouraging of my going to law school, and Judge Daughtry was too.
Yes.
She wasn't a judge yet, but she was.
How did you know Sissy Daughtry? How did you get to know her?
Well, she was an assistant district attorney at the same time my husband was. And her husband, Larry, was the Tennessean's Capitol Hill correspondent. So Larry and I were friends on our end of Dedrick Street. And Bo and Sissy were friends on their end of Dedrick Street. And we would frequently have lunch together and occasionally have dinner together. And we started going to the beach together. So every August when the court adjourned, we would go to the beach.
Go to the beach together.
So we got to be really close friends. And Sissy wrote a very encouraging letter to Vanderbilt Law School, which I think probably was a deciding factor of my being the older woman for the class of '82.
Was there what was that about it, being the older woman of the
Well, there was kind of an unwritten rule that developed around the time that Mary Schaffner started in the mid-70s, that Vanderbilt would allow a woman who was older than the typical law student to matriculate if she had qualifications that would have allowed her to do so had the world been different when she was younger. So several of us went. Sissy Leach, Bill Leach's wife went. Andre Blumstein, who already had her PhD in German, I think, went to law school.
Yes.
The dean's wife, whose name is escaping me, went. There were several. Judge Cowan, or Kennard, I'm sorry,
Yes.
who became the bankruptcy judge. She actually was in my husband's class.
Really.
They graduated in 71. But gradually throughout the 70s, you start noticing that there are more and more women in each class, such as in Sissy, Jane Ann's, and Rose's class.
Yes.
There were the three of them.
Yes. These are amazingly talented people.
Oh, yes, they were.
And-
They
and-
are.
Yeah, and still, yes, exactly.
I think Rose is still practicing. I think Sissy's full retirement came just this past summer.
Very recently,
Mhm.
very recently. So we've all had the benefit of,
Yeah.
of these amazing women. And how fortunate it is that schools like Vanderbilt saw the talent that was there
We really
and
are
opened
fortunate.
the doors and let it come in and let it thrive.
But it was very difficult for that group of women when they graduated. I believe Rose's first job, or certainly one of her first jobs, was with John J. Hooker and some of his enterprises
I see.
that he had going. Not sure what Jane Ann did. Of course, she went on to become the Commissioner of Revenue under Governor Blanton. Sissy's first job, well, first she opened a law office in the Stallman building and said she had maybe 3 clients. So she left there and Gilbert Merritt was appointed the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District. And he hired her as an assistant AUSA. And then Tom Schreiber hired her as a ADA.
Isn't it interesting that it takes people who recognize and appreciate talent to be the ones to say, we need you. Whereas perhaps the bar might not have been ready or willing or even able to see the talent that was there.
They were none of that. They were not even that later. Sissy was actually appointed to it. She was a professor after she left the ADA's office and was at Vanderbilt. And it was from that position that she was appointed as a judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals and was the first woman judge of Court of Record in the state of Tennessee. She was appointed on my birthday,
Oh my.
on my 30th
I
birthday.
knew that. But how was law school for you? And what was your experience there?
Well, I just hated it.
Oh,
I just did. I just hated
you already knew a lot of
it. Well, I didn't know it in the right order. I had been out in the world and done so much in the world that it was kind of frustrating to go back to school and be told, do it this way, do it that way. I think law school is different now because I think they do more statutory instruction and there's less reliance on the common law. I remember the first months of property law that went on and on about dead whales
Oh, yeah.
and the cache of coins under the roof. And I'm thinking, when are we going to get to probate?
Right,
Um,
right.
I never forget the dead whales. And of course, for criminal law was also common law, which was kind of frustrating.
At that time, it was common law in the state of Tennessee, wasn't it?
Yeah, and jury sentenced people in those days. Very interesting. So the state was trying to change it. And my good friend, John Rucker, was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I introduced him to my law professor so that they could kind of cross-pollinate each other. My law professor was very smart, but had not a clue about Tennessee law, not a clue. And John Rucker was a very smart man, but he was no scholar. So it was interesting to see the two of them who respected each other work together.
Learning to speak each other's language.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
And we came up with a good code. Like,
Yes. And there you were, you had all this experience already. And we're so familiar with the legislative process and the politics of Tennessee. And going back to school was an odd experience then for you, wasn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
it was.
But when you were in law school, did you participate in any of the programs they had, like legal clinic, for example?
I took all the legal clinic that I possibly could.
Really?
Because I wanted something practical to keep from going crazy. And of course, one of the things I liked about it was the ones where we represented criminals on post-conviction relief, people who
Yes.
had already been incarcerated.
Yes.
And I kind of got to be a bit of an expert in that sort of thing.
Yes.
While I was still a student, got the first clemency grant that Lamar Alexander ever granted for a lady from Memphis.
Oh,
That
how
was-
exciting that must have been
It
for
was
you.
very exciting. I was
Yeah.
very, very thrilled.
You have been someone who has recreated yourself many times over and became a journalist. You became a lobbyist. You certainly started a journal that is still important in this state, the Tennessee Report, that is now the Tennessee Journal. Is that right?
That's right.
And so you have had a lot of experience taking your life and bringing it through another door.
Well, I got to do everything I wanted to do except be a ballerina. That was beyond my reach.
Well, I wanted to say, when you finished law school, here's yet another door to open up. How did that? Tell us about that.
Well, that was different. Bo Edwards and I was separated my third year in law school. So I had to finish my second semester of law school, write the dissertation, take the bar exam, all in the middle of a divorce, which was difficult. And then I started looking for some place to practice law. It will surprise young women listening to this, I suppose, that I didn't just hang out a shingle, but women just didn't in those days. I imagine I would have ended up pretty much like Sissy did and just not had any clients. My dear friend Mary Schaffner, who was as great a lawyer as any I've ever known, went to work in an all-male law firm. And she said that she did it because she knew she wouldn't get any clients, which just was amazing. She ended up being one of the medical malpractice defense lawyers in this city and represented St. Thomas Hospital.
And an amazing appellate lawyer as well.
Oh, yeah. Yes, she was a great appellate lawyer. She was a real intellect.
Yes.
My approach to the law was more practical than Mary's. I was kind of a head in the cloud type. I wanted to see what law could do to help people. So I went around and interviewed with some firms and was politely shown the door. They were very polite, but they showed me the door. And so it became clear that things were not going to be going well for me. I got a couple of lobbying contracts. This was in the fall of '82. And finally passed the bar in October of '82. Around about that time, one of the people I was lobbying for told me that he had heard that Fred Thompson's law firm had broken up and that Fred was looking for somebody who knew criminal law who might do some work for him in Nashville. So I knew Fred slightly from political Vanderbilt circles and so forth. So I called him and made an appointment, and his firm had indeed broken up, but he had a whole floor, well, half a floor of the Am South building and 4 secretaries and clients. And he was in Washington most of the time doing lobbying up there. So I agreed to work for him for my overhead. And after the overhead was paid, and anything extra that he could charge for my services was fine. But that was a really interesting experience. Fred and I got along extremely well, even though that he was a rock hard Republican from Lawrence County, and I wasn't. One of the funnier things that happened was about 3 years after we started practicing together, I was representing State Representative Tommy Burnett, who was a state representative from the Upper Cumberland, who had been a client of my husband's, as a matter of fact, and of the late Louis Donaldson and of the late Ed Blank. And all three of them couldn't keep him out of jail because in the end, he had not filled out a form for his tax return and turned it in.
He was very, very popular with
Oh.
his constituents, wasn't he?
He was very popular with everybody. Everybody just loved Tommy. But Tommy had taken some bad advice from an auditor from the IRS who said your tax is such a mess with your law office burning and all. Don't try to file until you get it straightened out. So he didn't. So he had absolutely no defense to this misdemeanor of failure to file. In fact, the IRS owed him money while he was in the federal penitentiary. He got checks from the IRS, but there was no choice. He was guilty of these misdemeanors, and the government insisted that he had to plead guilty to misdemeanors. So he did, and everybody expected him to get 2 6-month sentences or 2 529 sentences. They would be run together, and he would be out in time for the election in the fall. This was in the spring of, I think it was 84. No, yeah, in the spring of 84.
And you were not that long out of law school.
Oh, no, I was not very long.
You
out of law
graduated what, in 1982? You
Yeah.
took the bar, and this is 2 years later.
I'm afraid it was. Tommy had
I think
run,
it's amazing.
Tommy had run through all of his money and all of his friends. And I think he figured that if Louis Donaldson, who was the Donaldson of Baker Donaldson, and Bo Edwards, who was a rather well-known criminal defense lawyer at the time, and Ed Blank, who was a state senator, couldn't help him, that he might as well try me. We had been friends at the legislature, of course. So I went down and talked to him and agreed to represent him for free. I, in the meantime, had investigated how he got sentenced. The federal district judge who sentenced him just flat didn't like him. Probably it was political, but for whatever reason, he sentenced him in such a way that he got 1 529 sentence, 1 6-month sentence. That meant he didn't have a year's sentence. As a result of an obscure, very obscure rule with the Bureau of Prisons, he would not be eligible for parole at all. He would have to flatten those sentences. Nobody knew that when it happened. It was, I guess Flora Morton knew it because of the way he sentenced him, but none of the lawyers knew it because the closest place, remember, we're pre-internet, the closest place that you could get a copy of the rules of the Bureau of Prisons was in what's called a federal depository library. And the nearest one was in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Think about that pre-internet. We are so used to the internet now that it's hard to think of what that must have been like when that service was not available. The internet was not around.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I filed a writ of habeas corpus and challenged the rule and challenged the application of the rule because it was unknown to him and to his lawyers at the time. I was granted the writ, and Tommy was granted a parole hearing, which occurred about a week after he was reelected to his seat by the people in the Upper Cumberland. So he was reelected while he was in federal prison. I got him a hearing for the parole board, which he was granted about a week later. It took maybe 4 weeks for the paperwork to come through for him to be released. And Ned McCurder had said to me, if you get him back by swearing in day, we'll swear him in. Otherwise, we've got to have another election. Well, okay. I got him in with 3 days to spare. And one of my proudest mementos in my office is a picture of him coming onto the House floor.
Oh my. Oh, my.
That was a
And,
great-
and think of this, you were, what, 3 years by this time out of law school doing
Well,
this.
Well, and he couldn't talk to the media. And of course, it was a great story for the media. They were all wanting to talk to somebody, so they had to talk to me. So one day, they came in the office and were waiting in the waiting room to see me. Fred came in the office and looked at the secretary and he said, well, you can tell the fellows they can come all back to his big office at the end of the hall. And she said, Mr. Thompson, they're not here to see you. And he said, who are they here to see? Her. Oh, really? It was kind of funny.
But this is what I meant earlier, and I said you learned to recreate your life so many different times. Here you were so new to the practice of law, and yet you had such an amazing achievement at a time when perhaps some of the people who were working at the firms that you might have applied for were sitting in the library. And there you were,
Getting people out of
getting
jail.
people out of jail who needed to be in the legislature.
Yeah, you would have thought that Louis Donaldson might have called me and offered me an interview with Becker Donaldson anyway, wouldn't you?
Well,
Since he didn't know what he was doing.
but from that experience, did you learn even more independence than you had already felt before?
Oh, absolutely, of course. And when you've acted independently and been
Yeah.
successful, then it stiffens your backbone and straightens your shoulders and you
Yes.
say, I can do that.
Oh, yes, yeah. And your experience before law school was not square one for you.
No, no.
You had so many experiences beforehand. All that came in, that was still came into the picture. You also represented Ray Blanton at one point, didn't you?
I did represent Ray Blanton. He, I forget what his total sentence was, but he had actually been in the same penitentiary in Montgomery with Tommy. But he subsequently got moved to Kentucky. But anyway, some of his friends took up a collection and retained me, since apparently I was the only one around who knew anything about post-conviction law, to represent him at his parole hearing. And he did get a 6-month time cut. I don't know if it was my advocacy or my keeping him from talking to him much.
Well, things were better off.
Yeah.
We're better off with your representation.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
a lot better off that I was there. So that, of course, got a whole lot of publicity since he was the outgoing governor of Tennessee.
Right. By this time, it's about 1986, and Ned McWhirter is now Governor McWhirter.
Yes.
And that led to your next adventure in law.
I did. I had some health problems. I had a surgery on my back, and I wasn't eager to go back to lobbying, which requires a lot of standing around on marble floors. And provides health insurance if you work for the state. So everybody assumed that I would go to work for Ned. And I said, no, the only job I want is to be the lawyer for the state parks. So it just happened I was offered that job. I thought it was a joke when I said it, because I thought why would anybody offer me that job?
But you had a good time in that job, didn't you?
I did have fun. I judged the Queen of the Rhone contest. I went down to Memphis to help with a golf tournament of all things. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
What an
But
interesting job.
It was interesting, but
And
it
you're
was,
across the whole state also.
oh, yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed that. But I just missed the real practice of law. So I went back into practice again, this time with George Barrett, who is famous as a labor
Well,
lawyer.
these are all giants, all the people that you worked with and who worked with you. I'm sorry, I interrupted, but go on.
Well, I was just going to say, George is very well known for doing such things as representing the ACLU to let the Ku Kluxers march in Pulaski.
That's right.
And he represented unions and he represented so many people. And he was just famous. Most of his work was in federal court.
You had a very interesting case while you were there that involved the General Jackson.
I did. I represented some young people who were improperly charged with a crime, mainly because they wanted to fire them and they wanted them not to be able to get their their employment security payments. And because there were 5 of them, public defender could only represent one. These were young people who had had summer jobs on the General Jackson. So I was appointed as special counsel for one of them. And it took me into the whole world of what that was all about. I got the charges dismissed for my lady in general sessions. Then when the other lawyers saw what I'd done, they got theirs dismissed as well. And then we filed suit. That's the against Aubrey Land and General Jackson. But in the course of all that, I was in court with a lawyer. Now, by now, we're talking about 89, 90.
Mhm.
And at this point, I'm on the Davidson County Election Commission. I'm in court with my client and I'm trying to explain something to the judge. And the judge was named Robert Murphy. He had been there a long time. He smoked on the bench. He was very rude. And while I was trying to explain my position, he whirled his chair around and stared at the wall. Made it clear he wasn't going to listen to me or my client. So I left and went out on the street right in front of the Ben West building and said, I'm going to find out who's running against him because it's 1990 and do what I can to help them. Well, I asked around and nobody was running against him. There was only one woman in the General Sessions bench. There were at that time 9 General Sessions judges. One woman was the only one who had ever run and had ever been elected. That was Barbara Haynes. And Barbara Haynes was running for the circuit bench.
Mhm.
So I discovered there were no women at all running for General Sessions, which is where they had domestic violence cases and all sorts of very interesting cases.
That's really where the rubber meets the road.
It really is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I want to ask you right now, your dad, your father had been both lawyer and judge when you were a little girl
Mhm.
in Jackson. And now here you are at the point of deciding that you might want to be a judge yourself.
Mhm.
Did you think back to your dad? What was your dad's influence on you that brought you to this point, do you think?
Oh, I'm sure. I always liked his being called Judge Harrington. And so the first time I was called that, I was like, yeah, I am.
And you were elected.
I was elected,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And I was the only woman who ran for the General Sessions bench. There were 2 women who ran for circuit court. That was Barbara Haynes, who had
Yes.
left the General Service, our General Sessions, and Marietta Shipley, and they were both elected, and I was elected.
And by this time you had been in the practice of law for all of 8 years. 8 years. And there you were.
In fact, not quite 8 years because I got elected in the spring and it wasn't my 8th-year anniversary.
When you were sworn in, what did you want to do? What were your objectives?
When I was sworn as judge,
Yes, yes.
I had promised during the campaign to create an environmental court. There was a city environmental court in Shelby County in Memphis. And the judge was kind of famous down there for enforcing the building codes and cleaning up Memphis. We got a lot of publicity. And so a lot of people in Nashville wanted to have a similar court in Nashville. The way it had been working in Nashville was that every 9 weeks or every week, there would be a new judge on the codes docket. And so if you wanted to get something cleaned up, you would say, okay, mister, you got to clean it up. Now you come back in 9 weeks. Well, 9 weeks is too long. And the judges were inconsistent about, some didn't think it was important, some did, most didn't. The city didn't send anybody to represent their employees in court. And so none of it was taken very seriously, but there were things that needed to be taken seriously. So I promised that I would set up a special docket. It wasn't really too difficult to do because there was one clerk who handled all of the citations for ordinances. It just took me working more than the other judges.
More hours.
Yeah, a lot more hours
Mhm.
because we held court every 2 weeks. But it worked.
That made a difference, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
It made a huge difference. I was the first countywide environmental court in the country. I had a nice spread in the Boston Globe. Yeah. And one time I was at the airport waiting to catch a plane and looked up in one of those news loops that they play. There I was walking through the old city dump out near TSU.
That's hands-on, isn't it?
No, it was very hands-on. I was wearing boots.
But what a way to be judging.
Yeah,
Be right in there, but where things were going wrong,
yeah,
trying to find a way to fix it.
yeah. The other thing I did, of
Yes.
course, that I think is the most important thing I did is the domestic violence docket.
Yes.
I couldn't do that by myself. It's just, there was too much of it. So I convinced Gail Robinson, who was not a woman, by the way. Somebody said when I was running, "Oh, you're not the only woman running. What about Gail Robinson?"
Oh, my.
Anyway, Gail agreed that he would hear cases with me so we could rotate. And so we did. We started the weekend of the Super Bowl in 1981. We had been told that that was a weekend when there were a lot of domestic violence cases because of alcohol. And so we had appointed by the district attorney, a dedicated prosecutor. Actually, ended up being two. Dedicated docket. And two dedicated probation officers who worked with the treatment community to try to figure out what the problems were. Was it alcohol? Was it alcohol and domestic violence? Was it domestic violence and anger issues only? They're very complex and intertwined problems. And so we set it up and dealt with it. And our probation officers knew that if they came to us and said, this person is not going to his AA meetings, this person is not going to anger management, that we would let them see the inside of a jail cell.
Enforcement was an important part of the success of.
It was, and sometimes it didn't take very long. Very often they would bring somebody back on the morning docket who hadn't been doing what he was supposed to do. I had one gentleman stand up and say, "Well, I know you told me to go to those AA meetings, but I didn't need to be there with all those alcoholics."
Oh,
And I said, "Oh, really? Oh, really? Ms. Jones, where are your handcuffs?" Taken to the 7th floor, which is where there was at that time a holding cell. It was actually the old city jail for Nashville.
Really?
On the 7th floor. Yeah.
I would think with that type of enforcement, that would help spread the word that
Oh, it did.
that your court was one that people needed to take very, very seriously.
Well, what I would typically do then is have Ms. Jones bring them back down about 3 o'clock and say, "How'd you like it up there? Would you rather be at an AA meeting?" And they usually would choose the AA meeting or whatever it was that we're supposed to be doing.
A lesson not only to that particular individual, but for anyone else who thought that this was something not to take lightly.
Yeah, I had a way of saying too, well, I know as you're standing there, you're very angry with me and you would like to come up and do something to me, but you don't do it. So tell me, why would you hit the woman standing next to you who cooks your meals, changes your bed and sleeps with you, but you won't hit me? And women said, I got feedback on this from the women, but that really made an impact on them. I don't know if it's true, but that was the
Do
feedback.
you think that this helped women to feel more comfortable in coming forward if they were encountering this type of abuse in their homes?
I think it did. I certainly think it made them more empowered to come back when they saw that they were treated well when they came. Sometimes, of course, women would say, and I'm sure they still are saying, "Oh, I don't want to prosecute. I don't want him to go to jail. He doesn't really mean it. He won't do it again." So, especially if it's been egregious behavior, I would say to the woman, the victim, you need to go to some of these women empowerment classes that the YWCA has to help you learn something about power and control in a relationship. And once you've gone to 3 or 4 of those meetings, I want you to come back and tell me what you would like to do with this warrant, this arrest warrant. And almost to a person, they would come back and say, get him. You know, I definitely want to prosecute. Let me tell you what he did, and let me tell you what my ex-husband did. I'd like to prosecute him too. So
what would your advice be to a judge who would be handling a court such as yours, which as I thought about it, decided would probably be one of the most explosive types of court that you would find in a jurisdiction? What would your advice be to a judge coming in to oversee a court such as that?
well, these days it's quite different. And I think the judges have a lot more protection. One thing in Davidson County now, the judges have their dedicated offices and hallways where the defendants can penetrate. In my day, the Davidson County Historic Courthouse was it. And you could end up on an elevator with somebody you just sentenced. But nowadays they have security guards at the back of the courtroom, and they have 2 of them for domestic violence dockets. Of course, the courtroom, I mean, the courthouses themselves have metal detectors, which were not there in my day. So the judges themselves are much better protected. But if you're talking about domestic violence dockets, the main thing the judge should do is listen and try to figure out what the dynamics are. Mostly in the misdemeanor courts, they're either going to be plea agreements or bind overs to the grand jury to go on for a felony prosecution. The main thing that you can do when you are the judge over a misdemeanor court, where people are pleading guilty to a misdemeanor, which carries 11 months and 29 days, is to have good probation officers whose judgment you trust and that they trust you, so that you can actually deal with the people and try to figure out what their problems are. Because there's as much psychology to dealing with that, I think, as there is law. And if you think there's not, then probably that kind of bench is not for you.
Well, and I was thinking as you were saying that when you assumed this responsibility for the domestic violence court, you brought to it something that was just beyond what you could read in a law book. You brought experience to it. What do you think helped you the most in deciding these cases, dealing with people who were in what would be an emotionally fraught point in their life? What was it in your background that you think equipped you the most for dealing with this?
Well, for presiding over the courtroom, my best experience was being a high school teacher. Because you've got a courtroom full of people and you need them to be quiet and you need them to pay attention. So that experience was really quite helpful in that regard. I very quickly learned to find out if anybody had children in there and try to put them at the front of the docket so you can get them out.
Right.
Because with the domestic violence dockets, there often were children and you don't want them hearing things. And if they're babies, you don't want them crying.
Right.
So that managing people in a setting of that sort, that was very helpful. As for the other sorts of things, I think it also had to do with my grandmother having been a welfare worker. And my mother drove her because my grandmother didn't really like to drive. She would drive her out in the country and drive her to some very poor parts of Jackson, Tennessee. My grandmother was very caring about people. She would come out to the car and take my sweater off if she thought a kid in the house needed it. One time she took my brother's favorite blue Keds and he cried all the way home. But the kid in the house had shoes. So feeling empathy for people, trying to figure out where they're coming from, why they're frustrated. it was during my time on the bench that we began to have a lot of immigrants in Nashville. And we didn't have any official translators. We were just kind of on our own. I remember one time we had a defendant who was from Haiti, and she was in the domestic violence court because her stepchildren, her husband was still in Haiti, but her teenage stepchildren had alleged that she had been violent with them. So she was in there. Well, they didn't know that I could speak French.
Of course you could. You taught French.
Well, of course, they were speaking Creole, but I could make out enough to know they were saying something along the lines of, "We'll get her." But what could I do? I didn't have a translator, certainly not for Creole. I thought about it. And then I remembered a lawyer friend of mine who was national president of the Alliance Française, who worked in one of the big firms in town. So I called him and asked him, and he had actually been to Haiti. I was fluent in French besides. So I called him and asked him if he would like to come represent this poor defendant.
And
of course, he worked with the district attorney, talked to the witnesses, everything was dropped. But that was a real shock to them. I had a court officer who spoke German, but we never had a German speaker. But we did have one time, it was right in the middle of the Yugoslavia breakup. And we had some people from those countries come in yelling at each other, and nobody could understand what they were saying.
what did you do?
I separated them and gave them a lecture on how you act in America. What could I do? It was just, it was interesting. I remember one time there was a woman from a Latin American country who said that her husband was controlling her because he had a passport.
Oh,
So I said to him, "Go home and get the passport." He said, "Oh, it'll take an hour." And I said, "I don't care if it takes till in the morning. You be back here with the passport, or you are going to jail."
my.
And he was back with the passport.
And I think that probably that is one of the ways that you as a judge had to deal with people. You
Yeah.
had to give them what their alternatives are so that they could see and that they were enforceable alternatives that were not pleasant.
Yes.
Yeah. And that made a difference, didn't it?
Yeah, for very many people, that tour of the seventh floor was all of jail they ever wanted to see.
Yes, I imagine so. You stayed on the bench for a number of years. Did you enjoy being a judge?
I did, but it was very tiring. Doesn't sound like it would be, but it is.
I imagine it would be.
I did some other things too. We were closing down the mental health hospital here, Central State. And it contained 500 patients. And they were moving into a facility that would hold about 120. And there were some advocates for the mentally challenged who were very, very concerned about what would happen. And so we were trying to bring together the police department, sheriff's department, which runs the jail, and the courts and other service providers to try to understand each other's role in what was about to happen to us. And as you can see from the homeless encampments that we have now, where there are so many people with mental illness who in an earlier time would have been at Central State, I'd like to think that those advocates for doing away with the institutionalization have changed their minds. I don't know if they have or not, but I think it would have made a difference if we had kept a larger facility available for longer stays.
Your role as a judge involved a lot of common sense judgment.
Oh, yeah.
It seems odd to say it that way, but that's really what it is. It's not necessarily something you can pull out of the Tennessee Code annotated. It's
Right.
common sense in areas where people's lives come in contact with the law in their homes when they have a difficult situation where there's mental illness. And you were called upon to assess a situation that might not have an answer in a law book.
Very often not. You know, the other docket, general sessions judges have in Nashville is an actual mental health docket,
Yes.
which
Yes.
nowadays is done by Zoom or WebEx.
Yeah.
But back then, they would actually bring people from Vanderbilt and Pavilion and where else? I think Vanderbilt and Pavilion were the main ones. They would bring them downtown to the court. And at Central State, there was a little courtroom. So you go out there and those were larger dockets, but then they bring these people down here. And then you have these people with these horrible mental health problems lining the hallways. It was just ridiculous.
Did you, when you?
So I said I wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
So I went to the hospitals themselves. Some of the older judges, male older judges said, "Oh, somebody will attack you out there." And I said, "I really don't think so."
It took some courage to do that when you were hearing stories like that.
No.
When you.
He didn't know because he'd never been out there.
Oh,
He wanted his court officers there on that high bench between him and those sick people. I went out there and sat at the conference tables with the doctors, listened to the stories, and then would try to get the people to agree they'd stay for treatment. Instead of saying, "Bang, you're going to be locked up for another 2 weeks," I would say, "Your doctors just described your problems. What do you think? Do you think you'd like to stay here and work on it with your doctor? Would you like to stay here and get your medication straightened out?" It was just amazing how many times they'd say yes.
you were really appealing to their health, weren't you? And their.
Well, I'm trying to get them to buy into their own illness and become a partner with a doctor to try to deal with the illness. Because if people with mental health don't have insight and don't realize that they need to be part of their own treatment, they're not ever going to get well.
That's such an excellent insight. That sets the path, doesn't it?
It does.
For getting things back where it needs to be in terms of treatment.
Well, it's one of the things the doctors will always testify about is whether they have any insight.
And that was one way of testing it. Their
And
own-
inviting
their own
them
interest.
into it.
Yeah. When you were that little girl and you were looking up to your father and his practice of law, and you decided you wanted to be a lawyer, did you ever think of it in terms of, could you imagine what the practice of law in your life would bring you to?
Oh, no, no. I mean, my view back when Dad was still alive was that I would practice with him in that funny little office in a 150-year-old building right near the courthouse. With one secretary and a dictaphone. And go out to the county courthouses like he did. I used to ride with him when I could get him to take me out of school. And go out to the courthouses around Madison County. That was fun.
So much of your life, though, was because of your own doing. You found ways to recreate, to find paths for yourself and to follow those paths. That was a remarkable achievement at a time when women had just everything they could do just to practice law, but to go beyond the practice of law, to enter into it in such a creative way.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed practicing law. It's been everything I wanted and more in so many ways. I still have some cases that are just lots of fun, although I'm trying to wind down. I have a view towards retiring
I was going to ask you what you are doing now. You are still in the practice of law.
Oh, I am. I just talked to a divorce client this morning. I swear she's my last one. My husband says I say that every time I take one. I've got a really interesting case that involves the only billionaire I know in New York City and some old airplanes out at the Smyrna airfield. That one's really interesting. I've got a couple of others that are interesting, but I'm kind of
You're still discovering, aren't you?
well, but people call me, I was about to retire this year. And then when my friend John called from New York City and said, I've got this airplane problem. He and Fred and I had represented him and a business partner in a deal back in the 80s where it was an amazing thing having to do with airplanes. And Fred and I really enjoyed it and enjoyed getting to know them. So anyway.
You just never know what the next day is going to bring.
You don't. You got to be ready for it.
But I want to ask you, with all the experience that you have had, with the years of practice and wisdom that you have gained, that you've gone along, what would you say to a lawyer just about to graduate from law school this May, who's starting out and who wants to look beyond, outside the box, outside the law firm box? What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I never wanted to work for anybody. That's one of the takeaways I knew from my father, was that I just never wanted to work for anybody. I was happy to do work, but I did not want to be an employee. He didn't, and I just absorbed that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I would say to a young lawyer is find a place where you can have a mentor. As I did with Fred Thompson, as I did with George Barrett, as I did with Mary Shatner. God knows I wouldn't have made it through the first 2 years of practicing law without Mary. I'd call her and say, how do I do this?
Somebody is down to earth and available as that.
Mm-hmm. But the other thing I would say is get as savvy as you can about technology. I was very fortunate that this whole shift occurred while I was on the bench. There was a little bit of it in the early 80s, but no regular lawyer could possibly figure it out. But by the mid 90s, Metro gave me a laptop, and gave me a few days lessons on how to operate it. And then I had all that time on the bench to play with it and learn how to deal with it and so forth. And I haven't looked back. So there's so much you can do now with technology. Cases are now almost always filed electronically or bless us, by fax. There's only one county that I deal with regularly where I have to use paper. And it's a big one and it shouldn't be doing it.
What has changed?
Oh, enormous change. Yesterday, I was trying to decide on whether to file a motion to dismiss or a motion for summary judgment on an issue. And my books are all in storage because of the tornado that hit my office.
Of course.
So I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to have to get on the internet. And of course, immediately found all sorts of things that were just exactly what I needed. Annotated this.
There are so many lawyers who went into this era kicking and screaming and resisting it. And what you did not, you had the courage to say this is something that can be useful.
Oh, yeah, because I could type. Not very well. If I had been a really good typist, I probably would have been a secretary all my life.
Isn't that something?
But I
wasn't a good thing.
Yeah, it turned out really well.
Right.
But
that's thinking outside the box.
Well, I didn't deliberately
a confining box.
I didn't deliberately fail all those typing tests. I'm not that good.
Luck was on your side.
Yeah. But I think these days everybody has to have a niche. It used to be, I would say that I wanted to be a country lawyer in the city. And I could kind of do that in the beginning days of practice. And I could do that just a little bit in the early 2000s. But now I really think you need a niche. I have a young lawyer who works with me, who he's been with me 5 years. So he's not a baby lawyer anymore. And he's made a niche for himself in probate. And I've kind of followed along because I'm 77 and it's time for me to know how to do probate. So we've been doing it for the last 5 or 10 years. And he's really good at it. He really likes it. We represent 2 funeral homes. We get a lot of referrals. And I think it's important that you pick a niche and kind of stick to it. There's a construction law firm in town that does great work. I wouldn't think of taking a construction case anymore. But in the older times, I would.
You would have. Mhm. But even in a niche, imagine that there's a lot of room for new development and for growth professionally, I would think.
I would think so.
Yeah, yeah. It's a different world, I think, for new lawyers now. I think it's a different world for women going.
Oh, it's such a different world for women.
Mhm.
I mean, it didn't occur to me when I got off the bench not to have my own practice. And that was just 16 years from when I graduated, when I wouldn't have dreamed of having my own practice.
And when you went on the bench, there are very few women who were judges
Oh, yeah.
at the time. And
Very,
you were one of the people who was going into new territory, uncharted waters. And at the same time, you were probably not aware of all the other people looking to see how you would do and what you would do.
No, I didn't. I didn't think anybody.
You
was
weren't
paying
thinking about
attention.
that, but I imagine that there were a number of women who were watching and saying, well, I can do that too. And
So,
what an amazing gift that was. You became a lawyer. Well, even before you became a lawyer, you were unique to begin with, and then used your law degree to become even more to find many possibilities. That
try to.
yes, yeah, and I wonder whether today women still feel that courage to go out and to go into areas where they might not have been before.
Oh, I'm sure they are. There is a Facebook group called Girl Attorney,
Really?
and it's women lawyers asking each other questions,
Yes.
and supporting each other and saying, do you have a form for this? Or have you ever tried this kind of case? And that's just, it's wonderful to see women supporting women that way.
Yes.
And somebody will come on and say, yes, I have, and you need to know something, call me. Here's my number.
Isn't that remarkable?
I understand it's a national thing, and most states actually have one of those.
Isn't that remarkable?
Mhm.
That gives, I truly believe that we need more lawyers. We really do. We have some lawyers all chasing the same clients, but we have so many people who could benefit from the good wisdom of a good lawyer.
Well, it's sometimes hard to figure out how to monetize.
Mhm.
That's one of the great advantages of technology, is because it reduces overhead so much.
Mhm.
When I was practicing law, one of the reasons George Barrett could be so successful was he had a huge investment in his library. He was one of the few sole practitioners who had a library that would stand up to Bestbury and Sims. Everybody else, would have the Tennessee Code, maybe the recorder. Well, like Fred did, I had the recorder, he had the
You
code,
had to pick and choose.
and a few other things, but you couldn't have anything like Bestbury had. You'd have to go up to the Supreme Court library.
Mhm.
I think at that time, though, I never used it, the National Bar Association had a library. But, that's how confining it was. But now with technology, there's just so many different things you can do, and you can reduce your overhead.
Yes.
I saw something on the internet recently about how to set up your law practice on $1,500.
Oh, my.
Well,
Yes.
now that wouldn't pay my malpractice.
No,
design.
no.
But you can see how you get started with a laptop computer.
And bring it into the courtroom with you.
Yes.
Isn't that amazing? What we never dreamt of in the 1980s. There's so much possibility today.
Yeah, it's just absolutely amazing.
Judge Penny Harrington, you are amazing.
Well, thank you for
It's been my
saying so.
honor to interview you today. And I am so pleased that your life is recorded, your professional life. Because there's such wealth in it.
Well, thank you. I'm considering this my exit interview from the practice of law.
Oh, I hope you don't. I hope, because I have the feeling that the phone will ring and there will be another case and you'll be off and running. And we'll all be watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate you asking me all these smart questions.
Oh, well, I just appreciate the honor of it all. Thank you.